Good to see everybody.
Thank you for coming.
Sure, thanks. I want to start by talking about a few things that I think are important for you all to hear and for the American people to hear. The president spoke powerfully about this last night. After a long investigation that turned over every stone and explored every theory, the special counsel decided that there was no case there. Notably, he said this would be true whether President Biden was president or a private citizen. The special counsel's assignment when he was appointed was to determine whether any criminal conduct occurred. He found it didn't. That was the finding. The case is closed. I want to read you something from none other than Ken Starr, who most people in this room will remember is the independent counsel who investigated former President Clinton. After that investigation, here's what he said to Congress, quote, "What I see the conclusion as being is just a determination that no criminal charges would be brought. Period. Full stop. That is it. It's all over at that stage," end quote. That rings true here. The special counsel report goes on at length about the president's unprecedented cooperation in this case. I want to share a few things about that because I think it's very important. One, when the classified documents were found, it was self-reported. The president directed his team to ensure that any classified documents were returned immediately. Why did he do that? Because the president takes classified information seriously. He always has. He did not intentionally take classified documents. He understands documents like that belong with the government. He never made any attempt to obstruct. Two, he took unprecedented action to get the special counsel what he needed. He opened up every room in his family home and his beach house for comprehensive FBI searches, a first time in history. He sat for 2 days of interviews. An interview that I'll add, and the president talked about this last night, took place the day after the brutal attack on Israel. The president was managing an intensive international crisis. You just heard the vice president talk about this. He answered dozens of follow-up questions to the special counsel in writing. 3, he didn't exert executive privilege over any contents of the report. He was transparent. He had nothing to hide. There was a long, intensive, and in many ways, yes, excessive investigation. But for context, you should all remember, in the case of former Vice President Mike Pence, who had a very, very similar incident occur right after President Biden, the case was closed within a few months. It was a brief, one-page letter to Mike Pence. But in this case, there was a 15-month investigation. The special counsel interviewed 150 witnesses. He sought and obtained 7 million pages of documents down to emails about moving trucks during the transition in 2016 and 2017. He spent more than $3.5 million taxpayer dollars exploring every possible theory that he could. And what was the result? He reached the inevitable conclusion based on the facts and the evidence that there was no case here. And this is important to think about in context of how this report is being viewed and by many of you being covered. This is the first special counsel investigation ever that hasn't indicted anyone. Every theory was explored, but the facts and the evidence disputed them. The decision was that there was no case to be made. In that reality, we also need to talk about the environment that we are in. For the past few years, Republicans in Congress and elsewhere have been attacking prosecutors who aren't doing what Republicans want politically. They have made up claims of a two-tiered system of justice between Republicans and Democrats. They have denigrated the rule of law for political purposes. That reality creates a ton of pressure. And in that pressurized political environment, when the inevitable conclusion is that the facts and the evidence don't support any charges, you're left to wonder why this report spends time making gratuitous and inappropriate criticisms of the president. Over the past 24 hours, we've actually seen legal experts and former prosecutors come out and give their analysis. Former Attorney General Eric Holder said the report, quote, contains way too many gratuitous remarks and is flatly inconsistent with long-standing DOJ traditions. The former acting FBI director said he had overseen many cases like this and, quote, you have to have explicit evidence of willful retention of these documents, and that is just not present in this case. The former FBI General Counsel, who I'll add was also the lead prosecutor in the special counsel Mueller investigation, said it was, quote, exactly what you're not supposed to do, which is putting your thumb on the scale that could have political repercussions. That's the assessment of seasoned professional law enforcement officials and prosecutors with deep experience at the Department of Justice. Unfortunately, the gratuitous remarks that the former Attorney General talked about have naturally caught headlines and all of your attention. They're wrong, and they're inaccurate, and they obscure a very simple truth that I want to repeat one last time, since I know it's hard to wade through 400 full pages. 1, the report lays out example after example of how the president did not willfully take classified documents. The report lays out how the president did not share classified documents with anyone. The report lays out how the president did not knowingly share classified information with anyone. On page 2, which I know you all read, the report argues that President willfully retained materials. But buried way later on page 215, the report says, and I quote, there is in fact a shortage of evidence on these points. 200 pages later. Put simply, this case is closed because the facts and the evidence don't support the theories here. The gratuitous comments that respected experts are saying is out of line are inappropriate. And they shouldn't distract from the fact that the case is closed and the facts and evidence show that they reached the right conclusion. With that, I'm happy to take questions.
Just a couple of housekeeping. When and whom was the president briefed about on the contents of the report?
The president was briefed by his lawyers.
And second, the president, and as you mentioned again, you thought some of the characterizations were gratuitous. Does the president still have confidence in Merrick Garland after selecting her to be put in this position?
The president spoke to this last night. I can't remember which of you asked him what his thoughts were on the appointment of the special counsel, and he answered that, I think, thoughtfully and powerfully, and I don't really have anything to add beyond what the president said.
And just finally, does the president support the release of the entire transcript of his interview to put to rest some of these things that you think are being overlooked?
Yeah, it's a reasonable question. I think that it's important to know that we're dealing with classified materials in this conversation. There are classification issues there. I don't have any announcement on, releasing anything today, but it's a reasonable question, and there are classified stuff, and we'll have to work through all that.
So, but once you can work through, like, say, a redacted version, would the president support the release as long as you can obviously keep what needs to be kept secret?
Well, we'll take a look at that and make a determination.
Thanks, Ian. 2 questions. First, you said in the topper that the president takes classified information seriously, and the president said last night that he never discussed classified material with anyone, but the special counsel's report said that on 3 different occasions he did discuss it with his ghostwriter. I understand it didn't meet the bar for prosecution, but how do you reconcile the president's statement with what's in the report?
Sure. Well, if you read the full report, it actually gets into each of those 3 instances. I think Justin rightly points out that we're talking about 3 instances out of 250 pages of evidence that they're talking about criticizing. I think it's important to look at those 3 examples. 2 of them are his own notes to himself in his personal diary that he was reading about to his ghostwriter for his memoir, for a memoir about his life after his son Beau died. And he was reading these passages that he had written to himself to share information with him, and he took pains, and the report lays this out, to express how sensitive some of the information was and that we should be careful with it. And of those 2 passages from his diaries that he talked about with his ghostwriter, weren't in the book. There's no classified information in the book. And so I want to just make that point. And the second is there's a kind of an allegation of willfully taking a classified document that he talked about with his ghostwriter. That's false. As the president talked about last night, he was again talking about a handwritten letter that he had sent to President Obama and faxed to him about the Afghanistan troop surge. Like, these are the president's own personal writings, the president's own diary notes to himself. And I think there's an important thing to think about here. There's plenty of historical analogs, the most notable of which is Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, whose diaries very famously became a subject of a lot of attention in the country. And the Justice Department knew that President Reagan's diaries had classified information in them, knew it at the time. He took those diaries home. He read those diaries to people. He shared the actual physical copy of the diaries, which the special counsel report talks about. Joe Biden never even gave custody of his notebooks to anybody, and they never even asked for those diaries back, and they never launched an investigation. And why is that? It's because historically, going back to the beginning of the country, presidents keep diaries. We should want our presidents to be thoughtful and deliberative about the decisions that they make on the most consequential issues of our time. And we have entrusted presidents to be safekeepers of this information, and we have expressed, great gratitude, including many of you in the press, when presidents share through books and other things insights into their thinking and decision making and historical context. And so I think it's lost in the shuffle of all this that the president did what all of his predecessors had done, which was take notes for himself, keep a diary of his own daily life so that he could think back on these big moments of the time. And so, that's important to know about this allegation that there was sharing of classified
Right, is your
information.
contention that just because the president rewrote classified material in his own words and then shared it with somebody who didn't have the security clearance for it, that it was okay?
Well, let's look at the report. I mean, we talked a lot about the report. I understand it's long, 400 pages. I'm not sure how many people in this room have read the entire thing. Page 3, which I think is what everybody's asking about and understandably says, quote, Mr. Biden shared information, including some classified information, with his ghostwriter, right? But if you go to page 248, the report says, quote, we conclude that the evidence does not establish that Mr. Biden willfully disclosed national defense information to his writing assistant. That's in the report. That's the conclusion that was made based on the evidence. And there's something else I want to add about this because we've gone back and forth. On page 1 of the report, it says the president willfully retained classified marked documents relating to Afghanistan. But on page 215 of the report, it says, quote, there's in fact a shortage of evidence on these points. On page 5 of the report, everybody read that, first few pages, says, quote, Mr. Biden's memory was significantly limited. But here's something that everybody should make sure that they see. Elsewhere in the report, he says, quote, we expect the evidence of Mr. Biden's state of mind to be compelling, pointing to him providing, quote, clear and forceful testimony. That's his comments on his state of mind later in the report. And so I think it's important to kind of take the report in its totality and understand that in that report, the facts and evidence refute the theories that are floated that they explored.
I think maybe we disagree on if he should have used the word willfully last night, but there's one other thing I wanted to ask you about, which is that his attorneys said that they were going to work on a process to make sure that none of this happens again.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's the potential that this administration has less than a year left, so I'm wondering if you could detail what the timeline is on that, what you guys are considering for that type of process.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that something that this issue a year ago brought to light is that this is a, unfortunately, very common occurrence in our country. The National Archives has talked about how 80 different libraries and collections just in the last decade or so have called and said, oh, we found classified documents in these papers. And they have a process that you're supposed to turn those back in. But then, we had the issue with President Biden. Immediately after that, we had the issue with Vice President Pence. And I think it's important to understand that this is a common occurrence, and the president thinks that we should fix it. Like, he gave all these documents back. He knew he did not, that these governments should be in possession, that the government should be in possession of these documents. And so what we're going to do is the president's going to appoint a task force to review how transitions look at classified material to ensure that there are better processes in place so that when, staffs around the building are rushedly packing up boxes to try to get out during a transition as quickly as possible, at the same time and up until the very moment that they're still governing and doing matters of state, they're going to try to make recommendations that can be fixed, and he's going to appoint a senior government leader to do that. We'll have more on that soon.
In 2017 that he had classified material downstairs.
Go ahead, Kelly.
He posted about it.
Go ahead, Kelly.
In your advocacy here and in the President's counsel writing back to Mr. Herr, you're saying that there were gratuitous comments, that there are false pieces of information. How is the American public supposed to process this when we also live in a world where former President Trump asserts that there was a politicized process that resulted in his prosecution related to classified documents and other things? So for the public, if Democrats and this administration say, trust the Department of Justice, trust the institutions, but you're also arguing here gratuitous political cheap shots and false assertions. How are they to process that?
Well, I talked about this actually a minute ago, and I think, when you have the former Attorney General, when you have the former acting FBI director, when you have the former general counsel of the FBI, these are experienced people at the Justice Department who spent decades working at the Justice Department, and they're saying it's gratuitous. They're saying that this is inappropriate, that this is inconsistent with DOJ policy and practice. That's them saying it. We agree. You heard the president speak forcefully about this last night. You heard the vice president speak forcefully about this today. We certainly agree that it's gratuitous. But I explained this a little bit in the opening. We're in a very pressurized political environment. And when you are the first special counsel in history not to indict anybody, there is pressure to criticize and to make, statements that maybe otherwise you wouldn't make. And, I think that it leaves you wondering why some of these critiques are in there. But I think it's also important to just fundamentally distinguish between the prior case that you mentioned. I want to be careful in terms of commenting on that. But the special counsel report goes into great detail about the differences and distinctions there. And I think it's important to understand that the criticisms that you're hearing of the gratuitous comments in the report, which are wrong, frankly, this is being shared by people who have deep experience at the Justice Department.
On the many issues related to memory, they certainly seem to prompt an angry response from the president and from his advocates. Is there anything being done to address that issue in an ongoing way? Obviously, counsel wrote asking for some of those things to be removed. It is potential that Robert Hur could be called before Congress to testify in public. Are there any steps that the administration would take addressing that specific issue? Is it in relation to overall medical physician's report of the president or other things to demonstrate what is the issue with memory, and is it a factor that deals with his capacity to serve?
Well, I have a lot of issues with the contents of that question, and Kareen's answered a lot about the president's transparency in his medical records and his physical and things of that nature. And I, leave that to Kareen to handle. But I'll say, I just read you this. Page 248, later in the report, he says, quote, "We expect the evidence of Mr. Biden's state of mind to be compelling," pointing to him providing, quote, "clear and, quote, forceful testimony." I can't explain why the report veers all over the place on this issue. I can just say, and as you've heard from the vice president, you heard from members of Congress yesterday talking about their recent interactions with the president. One, Congressman Goldman from New York, talking about his interaction with the president the day before this interview, when Congressman Goldman was on the ground in Israel, and the long and intensive and detailed conversation they had about what was going on the ground. We just reject that this is true. And I think that it does raise questions about the gratuitousness, and it raises, makes you wonder why that's in there.
Thank you, Kareen, and thank you, Ian. So you are discrediting some of the findings in this report. You are discrediting some of the observations of President Biden. So why should the American public accept the conclusion that charges weren't warranted?
I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're asking.
I'm saying you're claiming that much of the report is inaccurate. So why are you so confident that the conclusion is correct?
The conclusion's been obvious from the very beginning. It was a long, intensive, sort of meandering investigation that came to the conclusion that in February of last year, everybody knew that this wasn't intentional, that this was an accident, that they were found, and as soon as they were found, the president said, give them back, get them back as soon as we can, and fully cooperate with everything. So he reached the inevitable conclusion because it's the truth. The conduct of the investigation throughout and the gratuitous comments in the report are troubling, and they're inappropriate. But I think that the finding was the obvious one because it's the truth.
President Biden blamed his staff largely for the mishandling of documents and where they ultimately ended up. Does the president believe he did everything right when it comes to handling classified material?
Well, just look at the report. I know it's long, but the report talks about how the evidence is that these were most likely things that were packed up by staff during movements and transitions and things of that nature. So that's reflected by the report. It's not some accusation by the president. It's just true. I mean, you guys know, you guys work with White House staff all the time. We support the principal. That's our job. And the principal relies on their staff to help them with things. And the president said this last night. He talked about how, looking back, if he had been more, he wished to be more engaged in that process of the packing and the moving things to make sure that things were being done the right way. And I think the most important thing to remember is once it was realized that something wrong had happened, he did everything right to get it back and to fix the problem.
What about all the stuff that he talked about that was in his home, in filing cabinets that were either locked or able to be locked in his house? What stuff was he talking about? Classified materials?
Well, we talked about, I mean, the report goes on at length about this. I'd encourage you to read it. It talks
I'm
about,
talking about what he said last night. He said the stuff in my house was all in filing cabinets that were either locked or able to be locked. Didn't he put them in his home?
I'm not really following the question. I think that what's clear is that, and I told this to Justin a minute ago, he had his personal diaries that he had. Of course he has his personal diaries. The documents that were taken were jumbled up in boxes and found inadvertently in places, and that's what happened. So
We gotta move on.
Yeah, thank you. How concerned is the president and the team here that the, quote, gratuitous comments are going to damage him, damage public perception of him?
I think the public is smart, and I think that they can see what's going on. I think that they see a president who fully cooperated. I think they see a president who did the right thing and made sure everything got back. And I think that they see that this was a long investigation that ended without a case to be made. And, I think that they can see and understand, when people are gratuitous and make comments that they shouldn't make and that are beyond the remit of a prosecutor to do. I think that they understand that. And I think that they'll understand that the president did the right thing here.
If the 7th and 8th were obviously, or 8th and 9th were obviously like very busy days where the president was overstretched, taking calls in the middle of the night, all of this, why continue with the interview with her? Why not do it on another day? Why give him the opportunity to have these lines in the report about lapses, about timelines?
He should have thrown up roadblocks. Is that what you're saying? I mean,
I'm
no,
saying
he committed to it, and
and like, hey, the world is on fire. Could we do it another
I'll
day?
tell you what's interesting about this, and this is oddly not in the report, is at the beginning of his interview, the special counsel told the president, I understand that you're dealing with a lot of things right now, and I'm going to be asking you questions about stuff from a long time ago. I want you to try to recall to the best of your abilities, things of that nature. That's often what prosecutors would tell witnesses. So, he understood that, but the president was going to commit to being cooperative. He talked about this last night. He wanted to make sure he had everything he needed, and he didn't want to throw up roadblocks.
We gotta move on. Good.
Thanks, Shereen. Just a first question. Has the president read the entire report, and when was he given the report? Did he review it when his lawyers did the privilege review? And do you have any just context on when he himself found the findings of it?
We received the report yesterday from the Justice Department and formally sending it over. Obviously, the president's lawyers were doing the privilege review that we disclosed to everybody was happening and disclosed when we had concluded it. And so I think they were they had briefed him on the material as the client, as is typical in a legal case. And then we received the full report yesterday. The president's been pretty busy. I'm not sure he's read 400 pages. I'm not sure how many folks in this room have read all 400 pages of it, but he certainly is familiar with the contents of the report.
Just one quick follow-up. The president was animated last night, rejecting the idea that he did not remember when his son died. Can you provide a little bit more context about, was he directly asked in the interview by the special counsel for the dates? Was it part of a broader conversation? I just think some additional context to understand what is in that report might be helpful.
Yeah, the president was pretty clear last night, and I think that the American people have heard from him for years about the pain and the suffering that they went through when Bo passed away, and the gravity of that. And I think to suggest that he couldn't remember when his son died is really out of bounds. The conversations in the interview back and forth, he's being asked about, file folders from a basement and how did they get there and what is that and what were you doing around that time and things of that nature. I don't want to, just to be very careful, I don't want to get into specific things while it's still in a classification process. But, it is safe to say that, of course, the president knows when his son died.
So do you have any sense of why the special counsel would write explicitly in the report that the president was unable to recall when his son died?
You'd have to ask the special counsel why he chose to include that.
Thanks, Corinne. Thanks, Ian. So you said that you told the special counsel that the criticisms of President Biden were inaccurate, gratuitous, and wrong. So how did the special counsel respond when you told them that?
I put out his report.
So they ignored.
I'm unaware of any changes that were made in response to our very strong, forceful, and rooted in evidence arguments that we provided.
And you had just mentioned how these interviews happened shortly after the October 7th attacks. The president mentioned it last night. In mentioning that, does that mean that possible memory lapses happened because he was so distracted by what was happening overseas? Or do you dispute that he had any memory issues during those hours of interviews?
I dispute that the characterizations about his memory that were in the report are accurate because they're not. And I think the president spoke very clearly about how his mind was on other things. I mean, he was dealing with a huge international crisis of great global consequence. And, he was trying his best to answer questions in this interview because he wanted to be fully cooperative.
So there were no memory lapses during.
I think there's something important that people should remember about the way that sort of interviews like this happen. God forbid, one of you guys ever have to get interviewed by a prosecutor, and I hope you don't. Witnesses are told, as I mentioned by special counsel, to do the best they can to recall or remember things, and they're not supposed to speculate. They want facts. They want facts and evidence, and so I think probably in almost every prosecutorial interview you can imagine that people have said that they don't recall things because that's what they're instructed to do. So I think that's just important context to keep in mind.
And just lastly, in September, the president was asked about Trump's classified documents being found in Mar-a-Lago, and he said, quote, "How could that possibly happen? How could anyone be that irresponsible?" But there were classified documents found in the president's garage in a damaged cardboard box. So would that be considered irresponsible?
Look, I think the president made clear that he gave everything back as soon as he found out that he had it. And so, I think that it's fundamentally incorrect to try to analogize the situation or and frankly, the report says that too. And the idea that that he did anything except be totally cooperative and to take great strides to ensure that the classified documents were returned speaks for itself.
Okay, good.
Thank you. Ian, the vice president referred today to the report as being politically motivated. Is that the position of the White House, that this report was politically motivated?
Well, I saw the vice president's remarks. I thought they were very powerful, and I talked about this a little bit at the top of our conversation here today. There's an environment that we are in that generates a ton of pressure because you have congressional Republicans, other Republicans attacking prosecutors that they don't like. And it creates, a need. If you're going to determine that charges weren't filed, people are human and they're thinking through, what do we need to do? And, it leaves one to wonder exactly why he included a lot of the criticisms that were in there.
Also, with regard to the staff, President Biden has had some staff members who've worked for him for decades. He referenced their mistake last night. Has he had a visit with any of these staff members? Do the staff members who are responsible for taking those documents to his house, do they still work for the president? Have there been any consequences?
Well, I think I talked about this also before. I mean, this is an issue that has plagued administrations of both parties for 50 years, where accidentally things get shuffled up and taken and removed. And the archives has, literally they put a frequently asked questions page on their website about what you do if you find them accidentally. That's how often it happens. And, he gave them all back as soon as he found out about it. We understand that mistakes happen sometimes. I'm not going to get into sort of individual witness or parsing like that from the report.
It didn't happen for President Obama, President Clinton, President Bush Sr., or President Bush Jr. I don't know if 3 people makes it a common.
That's actually not true. Officials from all administrations from the past, half century or so have had this accidentally happen. But you're parsing 2 things. You asked me about the fact that, and the report states this clearly, that this was likely the result of inadvertent packing by staff. And you asked exactly about the staff issue, and so I'm responding about the staff issue.
Okay. And you can't say whether the staff still work for President Biden?
Well, I'm saying that the question you're asking about the frequency and normalcy, unfortunately, of mistakes like these being made, they happen. And what matters is how you respond to it. And when you find out that there was a mistake that was made, you give everything back, and that's exactly what was done.
Thanks, Ian. What does it say about Merrick Garland's judgment that he appointed someone who ultimately put out a report that was so egregious, so inappropriate, and flouted department regulations and norms?
I think the president actually answered this question last night. I'm not sure which of you asked him it, but he talked about his views on the appointment of the special prosecutor, and I really don't have anything beyond what he said.
Two things I was hoping you could quickly clarify. The report says that in 2017, the president told his ghostwriter that he just found all the classified stuff downstairs. Why did he not report that at the time?
Well, and this is included in the report as well, if you read through it. The president was talking about a handwritten letter that he had sent to President Obama that he faxed to him about the Afghanistan policy in 2009. And he says, and this is in the report, that and he said last night, I should have said sensitive. I should have said, really careful, more careful language about that, because he was talking about something that was a personal, like a letter he sent to the president.
So in his mind, it was sensitive, but what he said was classified.
Yeah, this is in the report. They talk a lot about how, the president actually took great care when talking with his book writer to note things like, hey, you need to be really careful with some of this stuff. I'm not entirely sure about it. And so I think that that's important to realize, that the report itself actually talks about what care he took with this sort of information as they explore all the theories and go through all the evidence that sort of refutes most of those theories, all of those theories, when you think about the judgment that there will be no case in this matter. So, that's addressed in the report.
And the second thing, the president also said last night, all the stuff that was in my home was in filing cabinets that were either locked or able to be locked. But the report says that some of the classified documents were in cabinet drawers, while others, about Afghanistan, for example, were in unsealed and badly damaged box sitting in his garage. So did the president misspeak last night?
Look, I think the president was responding to a number of inaccurate allegations in this report. We've talked a lot about, Justin asked about the diaries. I mean, this is his personal diaries. Of course, he has them in his house. So, I don't have anything kind of to add on what he said last night.
I want to follow up on the vice president's comments on, you've been saying gratuitous. She said politically motivated. Is it this administration's stance that this report was issued in part, or there was a motive in this issue, a goal with this report to inflict political harm on the president?
I think that you have to look at we talked about this at the beginning of our conversation today. You have a situation where former DOJ officials are talking about the political repercussions of these actions, and that it's incumbent upon the prosecutor to take great care to follow departmental policy, to not criticize unindicted conduct and behavior or characteristics, which we've seen in this case.
That's former DOJ officials. But this White House right now, is it the stance by this White House that this report was issued in part with a motive and a goal to inflict political harm on the president?
I heard the question the first time, and I have nothing to object to in what the vice president said. I thought she was powerful and forceful.
But also, just to follow up, I'm sorry, this administration, as you said that Republicans have often attacked prosecutors, independent systems, and you said that's created an environment where, if I've interpreted this right, there is an incentive by the special counsel to include some of this language. But often I've heard from Democrats and this White House say that those attacks against independent systems can also sow distrust with the public and those independent institutions. By saying that this is politically motivated, not just gratuitous, but politically motivated, does this not also sow distrust with the public?
I reject that. I reject that question. You see this, and it's in the report, the letter that the president's lawyer and the White House counsel's office sent to the special counsel to talk about the Department of Justice norms and policies that they see as being violated by some of the comments and remarks made in the report. And so, I think that that's a false equivalence kind of question, because what we have argued and what we continue to say and believe is that you're not supposed to make these sorts of things according to Justice Department policy. The president, when he ran, and you guys all know this because you heard this, talked about how important it was to restore the rule of law. And he understands that. And he talked about this last night, to MJ's point, about the appointment of the special counsel and sort of how he felt about that. This is a president who is committed to restoring those norms. And I think when we object to some of the gratuitousness in the comments that you're asking about, and you hear me talk about the former Attorney General and other people who've made those comments, they are criticizing that this does not follow those norms.
Do you think it was politically motivated?
Yeah, I know. We got to keep going.
With respect to the portion of the video and the transcript where he was asked about his time as vice president and about Beau Biden's death, why not release those parts of the video? Those aren't classified.
it's a transcript we're talking about, and I already addressed this with Justin.
Okay,
or
so what you're saying is this wasn't a video, there's not tapes that you can release of that?
I was just responding. I think that the question is about the transcript.
Okay, and as far as former Attorney General Holder is concerned, you referenced him and the normal DOJ review process. He brought that up in his tweet as well, or his ex-posting. What part of the normal DOJ review process is the White House saying was violated or bypassed in some way?
Well, there's actually, it's an interesting question. It's a little in the weeds, pardon me, but the special counsel regulations that exist at the Justice Department govern the process that is supposed to happen here. And the Justice Department has its own sort of manual of procedures. And, you know, as you've heard from those experts, you're not supposed to sort of criticize unindicted conduct when you're making these determinations.
Okay, Phil in the back.
Thank you. A follow-up and then a separate question. You said a moment ago that the president was responding to inaccurate information when he claimed last night that all the stuff in my home was behind locked filing cabinets. Is he entirely clear now, at this point, where all the documents were discovered? And does he now know that his statement about locked filing cabinets is false?
The report lays out in 400 pages of detail all of the evidence and all of the review that they conducted in looking into this matter. The president made sure that all of the classified documents that were found were returned promptly to the government, which is what you're supposed to do, which is why this is the inevitable conclusion that there is no case here.
And that's not what I asked, though. Does he know that his statement yesterday that all the documents were behind locked cabinets was inaccurate? Is he clear in his mind? I know that last night was perhaps, stressful, confusing environment, but does he
I understand what you're trying to ask, Phil, and I think that I've answered the question.
So I have a separate follow-up question, and that is, my follow-up question after that lack of a response was, there was an eye-popping moment in the report specifically about the president's ghostwriter, and that was that after he learned that the special counsel had began an investigation, he deleted some of his recordings. Now, those recordings were able to be recovered. What I'm curious about is, can you say definitively whether or not the president or anyone else at the White House was in contact with his ghostwriter?
This is in the report. I mean, read the report. In the report it says that they sought this, they looked into this, and that they didn't. So that's in the report.
They were not in
We're going to wrap this up. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Kareem. Ian, thank you so
Sure,
much.
yeah.
2 questions. Just for clarity, you're from the White House Counsel's office,
Correct.
But you're not a lawyer, correct?
That's correct. I'm a spokesperson.
Okay. Any chance that we'll get the White House Counsel to come out here and answer questions directly?
Should I be offended by that? I mean, I was.
I get offended all the time.
I know. I mean, what? I mean, come on.
You did say something that was factually incorrect. There has been a previous special counsel.
John, finish your question, please.
I was asked to come today by your colleagues in the press corps, and we happily obliged.
As you know, former President Trump, he was charged with a slew of criminal charges related to classified documents in his possession, including counts of willful retention of national defense information. In this report, it's made clear by the special counsel that President Biden willfully retained and disclosed classified material. He kept it in unsecured locations after his vice presidency, which presented, according to the special counsel, serious risks to national security. So my question to you, Ian, is can you explain to every voter out there, every American, why it is that President Biden essentially is let off the hook and former President Trump is now facing these slew of criminal charges, which seem to most people very similar?
Great wind-up, John. I mean, really a good wind-up. I talked about this already. Page 1, willful retention. Page 2, 15. There is, in fact, a shortage of evidence on these points. The report itself goes through in great detail the facts and evidence that led to the obvious conclusion that there was no case here. The report itself answers the question you're asking about the distinction between 2 cases, as you guys have heard us from the White House say for a long time. We're very careful about commenting on certain cases like that. I would encourage you, perhaps all of you, read the report.
I've read the report, and that's the reason why I asked that question. And the reason why so many people seem confused, because you hear willful retention of national defense information related to Trump, willful retention of classified material related to President Biden, and yet one individual is facing a criminal trial being brought by the Department of Justice in Fort Pierce, Florida, and the other one
Sure, I
is
think
not
this
facing
is-
any charges
Sure,
whatsoever.
and I think I've talked to many of you guys in the room over the last 24 hours about this. The allegation that there was willful retention of documents is refuted by the evidence in the report. And the conclusion was made directly that the evidence does not support that claim. He explored the theory. It's in there on page 2. Everybody focused on it. I'm exploring the theory of willful retention, but that the evidence as a whole was insufficient because that's not what the facts show.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Ian.
Corinne. Really appreciate it, guys.
Thank you.
There
Thanks,
was
Ian.
a previous special counsel probe